51.
So early 50s.
I came home in 52, and Dad had just acquired the boat, had made arrangements with the engineer, geologist, lawyer to haul the crew 7 days a week, out to the island.
What's your idea about how long that operation continued?
It probably continued up until the hurricane that just alleviated Shamrock Island.
And right now, I was on Shamrock just a few weeks ago. There's still a lot of structure on the north side of that island.
Well, that's probably still in
And it
it.
still has got to be
Yeah.
that's interesting. I know what that is now.
Now, whether he eventually sold it or something, I mean, that's when I had gone off to service. I come home, I go to school. I went to school 6 days a week, got out on Saturday noon, came home, and most of the time I would go out with them on Sunday, and they had a few chores for me to do so that they could pay me $20 to go to school.
What was we never got the name, or did we get the name, and I missed it, of the boat that replaced
I do not
Lucille?
remember the name of the boat.
Okay.
Mission Bell?
Then when he gave up that operation, I guess you'd say sold it, and the lease contract, then he bought the Mission Bell.
Okay, so the boat that serviced Shamrock, we don't remember the name on that one. Mission Bell came after that operation.
Right, the Mission Bell was a boat that belonged to the Mission Manufacturing Company, which was the Huffines house. Huffines, is that the way it is? And Mission Manufacturing owned it. And they were even giving up their operation or something. Anyhow, Dad acquired the Mission Bell. And it was a Briar-built boat, I think I have it mentioned, over at Rockport. And John Martin kind of filled me in a little bit there. They hauled her out here at Port Aransas and did some structural work in the bilge and everything, and I'm sure Daddy put 2 new Chevrolet Marine engines in it. And so he kept that, say from I'm gonna just grab a date, I think I have it recorded in some, from 62 to 76, because that was his 70th birthday, and it's when he was going to retire, so he sold the Mission Bell. A little sidebar there, but it is important. One of his good customers were the Chevrolet engine dealership in Waco, and they kept 2 rebuilt engines sitting in the garage, and every year Dad would swap out the engines, and they would pick those up and take them back. And
Every year?
yeah,
Wow.
two new, now not necessarily new,
Yeah.
but rebuilt engines, so they kept him supplied all during that period of time.
Right.
They said, what are you gonna do if you break down? Well, I got 2 engines. Well, you're going offshore, so we don't want you to lose any time. So
Wow.
one day, the truck showed up and there was 2 engines. And
Now you mentioned the Briars building boats. Briar up in Brockport. We have the Farleys here, another Farley family over in Aransas Pass.
Mm-hmm.
The Farleys here quit building boats in the early 70s.
Okay.
Do you remember anything about the folks up in Rockport? It just seems like the wooden boat building just stopped.
Well, the fiberglass boats came along. In other words, that's what little Hugh had in his Glastron. I mean, it was all fiberglass. And it more or less replaced the wooden boats.
As it should, I mean.
And
Maintenance.
you needed a,
Technology changed the art of building boats.
Absolutely.
and the Glastron folks were that was head Hugh
Hugh Alpha called him,
Hugh.
who is my same age, maybe a couple of years older.
And he started that as kind of
Well, let's say
Afterthought.
his uncle Gotcho was kind of a playboy, and Gotcho looked at little Hugh more or less as his son, the heir to his fortune. And I don't know where Hugh House was Mr. House's brother, but I don't know where he filled into the family, you know, as far as the estate or something, but little Hugh did inherit the entire estate of Mr. Gotcho House. And I remember Dad saying it was valued at approximately $50 to $52 million. Of course, that included WAI radio, no TV at that time. And I believe it was Southland Life Insurance Company. That was two of his businesses, you know.
The Harpoon would be a name, the name of the Charles Ursula boat, Mr. Ursula out of San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
And the Siesta would be
Yes.
Mary O'Connor Braman
Yeah.
of Victoria.
Right.
And so if we wanted to look at three of the early offshore fishing boats in Port Aransas, it would be a fair thing to say Lucille, Harpoon, and Siesta.
And there was one other boat
Yep.
that was private owned from somebody in Fort Worth, and
That's
I
right.
do not remember the man. I do remember he put his liquor in his mouth and spit it out, but would pour a little bit in his feed tube. So he had no esophagus. It's just one of the little
Yeah,
side.
I don't blame you not remembering him. I
No,
don't think that
but
would
he
be-
was around for many years.
And that would be a contemporary of these boats,
Yeah.
whatever that vessel was.
Yeah, it was a nice,
Was that craft
probably a 40-foot, they lived on it.
Okay, yeah. August 1939 would be a very important fishing date in Port Aransas because that is when your dad convinced sports writers from San Antonio and Houston, I don't know if that was the same trip or whether
No,
we're
they were
talking
from
about
San Antonio.
from San Antonio, that he could get them back from offshore, that even if they didn't see the land, he could find them their way back through the jetty, convince them to join him, and he showed them what sail fishing was about. And we hear a lot about sail fishing, some great pictures there. I have not heard you talk about Mr. Minter relative to marlin off the Port
No, he
Aransas.
never ventured off that far.
Or marlin further up.
Marlin, Mary Bremer was probably the first one to kind of venture out that far. Maybe Charles too.
I didn't know marlin were further out.
Yeah, they were,
Then
the
South
Marlins were further out.
Okay.
Or you would occasionally see one, but I don't recall Dad ever actually catching one.
Right, okay, so your dad expressly, he went for sail.
He was, let me put it this time, he was 90% sail fishing from starting in the fishing season of 1940 to the end of the 51 season.
Okay.
So 11 years.
When the deep sea roundup was finally recognized as the deep sea roundup, we're figuring the early 40s.
Mhm.
Was your dad an annual competitor, or was he hired by people
No, he was hired, he had
By fish?
customers, yeah.
to fish that tournament?
Mhm.
Okay. Did his boat win that tournament? Can you remember?
There were times that he did, and the reason he generally did is because sometimes he may have only caught one fish during the 3 days, but the light tackle that he used.
Mm-hmm.
So it was based on fish weight, length,
Right.
and I remember the silk line that he took off, and we strung it between the piling, little bars that he had there.
Mhm.
He'd wash it down with fresh water, and an hour or two later they were dry, and he would put them back on the reel. That was some of my chores
Wow.
in the afternoon when I'd come over.
What pound test do you think that was?
I'm gonna say, and I asked him about it several times in the latter years, and he said that's right, it was three thread.
What's that mean? 3 pound? What? I don't know what
I
that
think
means.
that means 6 pound.
6 pound test? That is amazing.
I mean, it was, In other words,
That's
the
amazing.
man was a true sportsman.
Absolutely.
He didn't care about putting a lot of fish in the boat.
No.
Of course, I don't know whether they had to bring them in on tournaments or not. I think they probably did. But he was interested in catching a sailfish on real light tackle. Just like I have pictures, I have had more enjoyment in catching little trout in high mountain streams on a fly line than I would catching a bunch of kingfish or redfish. So that was his, in other words, he was there strictly for the enjoyment of light tackle
I
fishing.
have a name, A.E. Kiesling or Roy Kiesling. Do either of those names mean anything?
Say it again.
K-E-I-S-L-I-N-G, Kiesling.
It's ringing a bell, but I can't think of anything.
He built the marina where Skelly's was and Tarrant's and in 1939.
Inside the harbor?
Yes, and he evidently was a great fisherman. He loved sport fishing. So I don't know whether he might have had a boat there. That was the only question.
Which marina did he build?
The one that's it was opposite the Coast Guard station.
On that side?
Yeah, where Skelly's was or Tarrant's.
Okay, that's what I was getting ready to say. It's coming to me. And there was Terrence and Studemans. Those
Right.
were the names.
John Henry, right? Henry Studeman.
Those were the names of that facility. And that's where Dad was operating out of in the summer of 49 and 50, because that was the 2 summers that I ran that private boat. So I don't remember whether it was Studemans or Terrence. But yes, Keesley apparently was the one who built it then.
You're speaking about running private boats. Your dad, clearly, that the Lucille was his machine, his
Private
fishing
boat.
machine. But would he captain for hire on other boats?
No.
In other words, if someone said,
Mary Bremer, if Dad did not have a party, and I'm talking about particularly those years that Henry Studeman had turned, if he didn't have a party or they didn't show up, Mary always got there late because she drove to Victoria. And he'd say, come go with me. And she would pay him just for the fellowship and that, the same fee he got, like $25, maybe $30, $35, you know, as the time progressed. So that was the only person.
right,
Now, Dan Eamon was a good friend, and if Dad wasn't busy, I'm sure he'd, because I know that he would go with Dan, and particularly they would go down in the lagoon after 1949. And other than things like that, no, he did not have a habit of.
right. And speaking of fees, if I fished with your dad, if Mark and I fished with your dad in 1940 to go offshore for sailfish, would Mark and I pay $25 a piece?
No.
For the party, it
For
would
the
be
party.
$25 for the party.
I have gone back twice to the Billmores,
Yep.
and I think I've told you before, one time in the early 90s, my dad died in 97, we were over here and went in Billmores, and just as you walked in, on the wall right there was a, what we call a flyer, Port Aransas Boatman Inc. rates. $15 and $20, I think it was by the size of the boat, how many people you could take on it. And after the first printing of it, they redid the plate and put plus $5 sailfishing, Byrd Mentor. So that brought the rate for 2 or 3 people did make it. Dad did not like to have more than 3 people, because only 2 people could really fish if you're, because that's the size of the boat and the other person, and what he preferred just 2 people because.
Did your dad prefer?
But we have not been able to find that
Brochure.
Bill Moore or whoever it was gave Dad a copy of it, and it was in the file, but Dad gave so much stuff away. It's just,
Your dad, to fish sail, he would deploy his outriggers.
mhm.
And did he prefer artificial or
No, he always used
ribbon fish or?
ribbon, no, he used the bellies of a kingfish. And just made a triangle, you have your rib, up the front, where you cut the gill, there. And then you just cut the belly out and make a strip, and then put your hook, through there. And I don't know how, but he did sometimes use big treble hooks. Not big, but that way you have a better chance of hooking them. And then you had your long steel leader, and then went to your silk line, and that was it.
Mr. Byrd Lee Minter Sr. and his wife's name, your mom's name was?
Lucille, Lucile.
There's no two L's.
No two L's.
And that's the name of the boat, Lucille.
That's it.
Now I got it.
That's the reason I call it his Lucille.
1,350 miles Corpus Christi to Guaymas, and that was a distance that he recorded from the odometer.
Well, you
I
punch
do
it
that.
out now on the internet, and that's what it is too.
Okay, so that's one way.
Yeah.
Yeah, one way. Offshore fishing, done by your granddad, offshore in the sense of really only a quarter mile off the
Yeah, it was
surf
just
line
on,
of
just on the beach almost.
the St. Joe and Mustang.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. I read this last night. Had you read this?
No.
On the turtles.
I have some other questions. You mentioned yesterday Bubba Molina as a contemporary guide in those days.
That's the name I remember Dad always make a reference to.
Are there any other guides from that era that you remember? Are there any other guides from that time? You mentioned that you knew Florida Roberts.
Really, yeah, people like that. I can't really remember because Dad and I didn't associate over
Right.
here. He went home when the day was over with, and
Barney Farley would be a name.
Barney Farley and
Ted Matthews, I presume,
yeah,
would be a name.
Matthew, some of them, and I remember Bubba Molina. Just of course, everybody called everybody by the first name. Dad was Red. Of course,
Was that right?
Yeah, he was red.
Red hair?
Red hair, very light complected, red. And the one picture that I show him, he's painted up with zinc oxide, and I had people in Dallas say, "Is your dad the guy that looks like a clown?" So he was known for he didn't just dab it on, he smeared it on. In fact, well, neither one of you there, but my lady friend Naomi, she said of putting the pictures together, she said, "I don't want one in there with him a suit, because nobody ever saw him with a suit. Have one with him with the zinc oxide." So that's one of the primary pictures I have with him. And in our family pictures that we'll have, I have a nice picture of him in a suit. And but the one I had on yesterday, he always wore. That's another story on that. But that was his pride and joy. When he was dressed up, he had a shirt on like you have on, long khakis. Had a pair of Jarman, kind of semi, smooth skin, not cowboy boots, but they were dress boots. And his shirt hardly ever had more than one or two buttons, so that it fluffed around. He had the air, and he had that bolo tie that I had yesterday on. So that was his formal dress. That's the way he went into the Yarbrough's office in Dallas.
Did his sun protection work? Did Mr. Minter
Yes, sir.
avoid
Yes,
skin disorders?
he had most beautiful skin in his latter years. Never had called skin cancer. Always had, when he was on the water, he always had a big brim almost like a Mexican sombrero, or a big cowboy type hat. And otherwise he wore a bib hat. That was one of the things we called it the back porch. There was several hundred hats lined up on nails, hangers.
Was it medically described to you why your dad died? Was it?
Yes, he was.
You don't have to share that with us if you
No,
don't.
I mean, he, like I told everybody the year before, if he gets the sniffles next winter, he won't make it. And I talked to him on a Sunday, and I hadn't gone down for 3 or 4 weeks because I had had the flu. So I didn't want to go and expose him to that. And I said, Dad, I'll make it next week. And he said, I'm fine. I got a little sniffle, but I'm fine. And literally his voice was strong, had no trouble hearing me. And my aunt couldn't get me on the phone, called my son. He died on Thursday of pneumonia.
And Mr. Mentor, are you aware that probably the pneumonia your dad died from, there is a vaccination against that pneumonia now? Are you taking?
Yeah, I'm taking pneumonia shots.
Are you?
Or it was just
And
congestion.
shingles.
Yeah. Bud said he was still sharp mentally, 90% sight impaired. He was always one-eyed. Nobody realized it, but had lost his right eye when he was just a kid, and through a nigger shooter.
Anything else before we turn to turtles?
Probably will. But, I want to know about the bananas, but the turtles are more important.
Okay.
Turtle market, a fascinating piece. This will be very helpful to a friend of mine who is writing a state historical marker on the turtle business in this coastal Bend area. And I'm going to share this with him if I have your permission. And
You have it.
he's about your age, and he is the man who is in charge of all of the historical archives of Nueces County. And so,
Okay. But see, when they did the bicentennial book on Texas, Dad was the co-chairman of the coastal end of San Patricia County. And so in that San Patricia County book, Dad was not one to promote himself, so Aunt Pauline contributed most of the articles in there. I mean, you know, she mentioned Dad and the granddad's, but in that book you'll find a lot of the details of some of the shrimping industry.
right. Well, but let me just kind of go through the high points of this paper. I'm just going to read straight down, bring Mark up to speed a little bit, and
Okay,
then
go right ahead.
you might amplify some information here for me, please. It appears that your dad did not start out to drag for turtles. It seems that the turtle came along with the shrimping, and that on occasion there would be turtles found in the shrimp nets. This would be your dad was shrimping close to or
Well,
in the Corpus Christi Pass at this point. Or your granddad.
Yeah, Granddad had 4 boats, and then after 1990, he lost all those, and he built 6 boats after 1990.
Okay.
And there were probably a half a dozen other boats that were private owned, you know, by individuals. So you had a fleet of 8 to 10 boats, maybe 12 boats that operated in the Granddad's fish house.
It sounds like before, if we use 1919 as sort of a date, it would appear from the article here that the involvement with the turtle industry started before 1919.
Yes, it did.
And would 1912, 13, 14 be
Go back almost to the very beginning, say 1911, 1912.
Okay, so this would be the start
He
of,
had the fish market started in 1909, and then the shrimp market started in 1911.
the fish market was 1909,
Mhm.
and 1911 was the
Beginning of the shrimp market.
shrimp market, shrimp
Mhm.
market. You know, just to the side, I was reading about the history of shrimp recently, and as you said yesterday, a lot of people think that shrimp is something people have enjoyed here for several hundreds of years, and it's a relatively new seafood. And I was reading that one thing that promoted the shrimp industry is when they finally invented the trawler so they could gather shrimp in quantity.
And that's when Granddad, who did that, I don't know.
I-
Granddad built the boats and somebody built the trawls.
Right, right.
And then in later years, his brother-in-law, who was married to Pauline, Joe Massey, he became the net builder.
Mhm.
And the net people, he never went anywhere. Hardly ever left this area, except he made a trip to Tampico. And the Champlin net people carried him down to, what was that place? Down in South Louisiana for a net cutting and webbing and contest.
Mhm.
And I think I remember them taking him down there 2 different times, and he won them every time.
Mhm.
Or he could cut the net so faster than anybody.
Mhm.
And by coincidence, the daughter of Mr. Champlin, I'm getting ready to meet her. I've been talking with her on the phone for 2 years now, and I'm getting ready to have a visit with her. She lives in Jonesville, Louisiana, and their company is there. They're one of the largest net twine people in America.
Granddad was a true entrepreneur. Turtles were a new product, and that would be a new food product we're
Yeah.
talking about, right?
What am I gonna do with these?
What are we going to do with these guys? Well, you're going to sell them to the Rice Hotel, and that's significant in and among itself. But what's particularly significant is getting those turtles up to the Fulton Fish Market in lower Manhattan, down by the Bowery. So, wow, that is
And how
quite an
that
accomplishment.
happened,
Yeah.
I don't know, and
Yeah.
Dad said he probably didn't know either, but Granddad had a broker in St. Louis.
Mhm.
And he would go up there by private railroad car occasionally. And I'm sure that broker is the one that established that contact.
And the turtles, while they were awaiting transportation, were held in pens. And Dad and Harwood told their chores of catching adequate crabs to feed the turtles as they were waiting for shipment. And would you help us understand where the pens were?
They were, now we're talking about before the seawall was built.
Okay.
And there was that little island, so to speak, that was the spoil when they dug the channel and the basin.
In the Con Brown area?
No,
No, in the
just the Ranges Basin.
Ranges
Where
Basin.
the channel came in, and it was just a round,
The Ranges Channel came in.
kind of a round
just-
channel with a beachfront,
Okay.
that. And in the flats out around that little island,
Okay.
they built them, though I'm sure there was a little water, there, but they built the wooden pens.
Do you know if during this time of the start of the turtle industry, if there are any comparable pens in this area, in the Port Aransas area?
One, Dad mentioned in one of the articles that he recalled some operation over around Fulton. Well, 20 years ago, we were traveling, and still do, through Tybola. And there used to be 2 service stations on each corner. And it was a pit stop, I guess you would say. And one of them on the wall was maybe 15 or 20 pictures of just nothing but turtles. And I was just flabbergasted, and I asked the Mexican what, the history of it. And he said, well, his dad and uncle and, the family, they would accumulate the turtles from Port Lavaca and over in Rockport and keep them until they had enough to bring to Aransas Pass
Right down to your granddad.
for shipment.
Yeah.
And so yesterday I stopped, both of the stations were gone, but there was another station right there, and the old Mexican people right next to the little cafe that's been there for 100 years, I guess. And she said, oh, that station was on that corner right there, and I remember that. And their name was a typical Mexican name, but she didn't remember any of the history of it. And she was real nice. She said, I'll ask Jose if they still have any of those pictures. So I may be able to get some of those, but one of those things you don't think a lot about it when you stumble into something like that. You don't start thinking about history until you get old, really, you know.
We have pictures of, we believe, turtles being harvested here in the Port Aransas area. Turtle Cove, I don't know if the name Turtle Cove was named because of the turtle population there or not.
I don't know, but I do know there's a Turtle Cove.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly where it is.
But your dad didn't talk, you don't remember him talking about the turtle industry in Port Aransas?
No.
Okay. And,
Because there weren't really any shrimp boats. They may have just caught them on the beach, or they may have come in through Corpus Pass, something like that.
well, you know, interestingly, what we've understood about the turtle industry here is that when people would butcher their cattle here to send the hides and the tallow and the horns to market, there was no way. Of course, this would be the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There was no way, of course, to preserve the meat, and so they simply throw the meat in the water. And what we've understood is that that created quite an attractant for crabs. And if you're attracted crabs, you're going to attract turtles because turtles eat crabs. So we just had a food vector system. And that's one thing I have heard about why we had a pretty consistent turtle population around here, because of an offshoot of the cattle industry.
Okay, you're talking about butchering cattle.
Sure.
In the Rockport Museum, Chamber of Commerce, somewhere, they have a lot of, books of history. And there's pictures there where they would pile the meat up and try to burn it. They'd pour gasoline or diesel on it, at least to keep the smell down. Then, as the market, the early day market was for the military, they would put it in brine barrels, I guess a whole quarter of meat, and ship it out to the military. Which, what would it become if you soak it in brine water? Corned beef?
Yeah, spam.
Okay. But that's very interesting. Dad found the book, and I went over there with him, read it myself one time.
And then Mark will be intrigued by your story here of your visit to the Fulton market in the 70s, and then the hookup, and then they got to talking, and they realized you're the man. It's a fascinating story. You will enjoy that more. Anything else about the turtle?
No, that's basically it. It said it just was a period of time that I guess only Dad's stepmother took pictures. And there's just not any of them of that era.
Right. Yeah.
See, Dad's mother died when he was 6 years old. And then a couple years later he married Mrs. Gristy, so that's where Harwood came into the family, and his sister.
That'd be your stepbrother.
Be Dad's stepbrother.
I mean, your dad's stepbrother.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about your father, your grandfather buying your fish that you got when you were 7 years old, when you went out and got it. So that would have been in the late 30s,
Yeah.
39 or so. How long was he in the fish business?
That was about the time that he sold out, 38, 39, and he had that house up on top of the seawall, and that was where they lived,
Your granddad.
Granddad.
Okay.
And in fact, that's where Mother and Dad were living when my brother was actually born there, and Mother went to the hospital with me because I was the first child. But it had just a massive, massive big front room. Couches, pot-bellied stove, chairs all over the place, a big dining table, small kitchen, small bedroom, and a little office. And probably in the early, before, yeah, probably right at the time of the war started, he built a 3-apartment unit down below the hill. Or three upstairs and 1 downstairs. That's where they live. And there were 3 or 4 garage stalls. And he started to pour in plaster of Paris greenware. And the carnival people would then buy it from him. And during the winter, they would paint it ready to go on the road the next year. And then everybody thought they were going to starve to death. So he built a bunch of pens with net webbing, some kind of vine grew on it, and he started raising ducks. And Harwood lived out by the cemetery, and he started raising rabbits. So we had plenty of rabbits and ducks to eat during the war. And then he built another house right against the bottom of the hill, which was a nicer home, and had rented the place. Well, he put in a little grocery store up on the hill, and then grandmother's brother was coming back and forth all the time, and so he kind of let him have it or rent it or something, and he expanded it with a lean-to, and they would buy fish then from the fishermen, and Mr. Hancock had a little truck that he could put the barrels of fish in, and he would haul them to San Antonio to that Jordan market. But somehow they were related to the family. I don't really remember. But he continued then, and then he moved uptown, and just one of those coincidences, he bought the house from Jonel's grandmother, who raised her, and it eventually became the old red barn on top of the hill, a bar, and it was eventually torn down about 10 years ago. Yeah.
We have done a lot of what I call structural history yesterday and today, and that's looking at events and boat names and sort of objective things.
Yeah.
And there's, of course, another kind of history that is of interest to folks, and that is what we call anecdotal history, and those would be stories about the various events and the structural stuff that we study.
Okay.
And you told an excellent anecdote yesterday about the tooting of the ferry mooring relative to the illegal establishments on the Port Aransas flats when you were coming across as a deckhand, warning the captain there's an officer there. I'd like to this morning pursue and give you the chance to share some stories with us. Your dad is going to be in Port Aransas history. Your dad will be going down as a very important figure in the fishing industry, sport fishing and game fishing industry. And he's going to become a significant figure relative to duck hunting in this area. So as I'm going to be writing the history, and perhaps people reading, seeing this film may even pull out other aspects of Mr. Doug Mentor Sr., but I'm going to be emphasizing the sport fishing and hunting thing. Good stories about that. Did your dad ever have a fish story about a client, a party, whatever, that you remember as particularly humorous or insightful or weird or?
No, they were just all routine of my job as a youngster, even up till I was freshman, sophomore, junior in high school. In the summertime, I would be over here and say waiting for Dad to come in, and I would help the people get their gear out for the boat and maybe hang their fish up if they were going to take a picture of it. And time they got ready to go, they paid their bill and gave Dad a tip, and they'd give me $1 or $2. So, I mean, that was part of my goal, I guess, to be over here. I mean, it was a little chore. If you can make $1,
Well, sure.
you can make $1 a day with, through the 40s. That was maybe not every day, but so that was my goal of coming over, to have a little chore.
Did you ever have a boat breakdown? Did
Dad,
your dad ever have a boat breakdown?
Never.
And that's because he ran the new engines or rebuilt engines every year.
That's because he took care of that engine. Never would let anybody on a boat until it was cranked up and ready to go. He was just so super safety conscious.
And there's one thing that your dad could not have known because they didn't have the resources in those days. There are squalls in the Gulf of Mexico.
The what?
Squalls. Squalls.
Yeah.
Did your dad ever hit some bad weather out there?
Oh, I'm sure he did, but he had sense enough to recognize to see him coming,
Right.
and would do his best to get in. And there's one story my wife reminded me last night to be sure and tell. As we were standing on the jetty, there's one of those walkway where they have the glasses. And she said, don't forget to tell them about the airplanes and the dope. Okay, Dad had, let's say during the period of the Mission Bell and the next boat, he would go southeast. And apparently there were some wells down in that area that were his prime locations. And in the evening, he would come straight in and then come down the beach of St. Joe Island, close enough that there were 2-engine planes flying.
Now, whoa. I had him down southeast, so I had him down Mustang.
Oh, excuse me, then I'm saying, no, southeast would be St. Joe.
That'd be north.
Well, okay, north then, okay.
But
Yeah, we're in the
he'd be fishing north,
He'd be fishing north.
and he'd come directly west to the island,
To the
because
island, and
then he'd
come
head
down.
south
In
to
other
get to
words,
the jetty.
out of the,
Oh, he's running back to the jetty.
coming back home.
Okay.
And this 2-engine plane would come in and land on the beach where there would be 1 or 2 single-engine planes. And it just happened to be they were in the mid-afternoon, was kind of their routine schedule. And say, Dad got to the point where he said, I could even recognize their face if I saw them in town. I mean, he was that close in. And so that's narcotics coming across the Gulf onto St. Joe Island. The same thing that was doing in Louisiana, that they made the movie of him, and he finally, by a judge's order, got assassinated by the way the judge where he said, but I think his name may be later.
Now,
But
what year was this? This would be in the 70s?
Yeah, this would be in the late 60s and 70s.
That's a good
Because,
story.
you know, once Dad began to realize, of course, the boats that started to go to Campeche, they were the big source of marijuana coming in. I mean, the boats would go down there and come back with bundles of marijuana. And, but this was just another method of what they were flying in. It would probably be marijuana. And you just don't know. But you have a protected area. Nobody's going to be over there.
Did your dad ever have, speaking of St. Joe, did your dad ever have any interaction with the Perry Bass family?
Oh, yes.
Did he fish them, or did he?
No, it was primarily going over to the island. They would go back to the period of time when they took Eisenhower. But Dad, the fellow that was managing the ranch was Dad's same age, and he was from Stephenville. So they had a connection there, although they did not know they did not know each other when they were kids, but after he came over there, and then he had a son that was about my age, and then Harwood was in the radio and then TV business, so he was the radio man that would go over there, you know, hook him up with radio, and then when TV came along, and we would go over there and with our 22s and shoot rats up in the papaya tree, yeah. That have the black seed in them. Yellow meated,
I think it's papaya.
yeah, papaya. And rats just infested,
You rat shot, didn't you?
yeah. Well, not only sometimes, we just sometimes carried I had a 410, during that period of time, I had a 410 double barrel L.C. Smith.
I used to shoot rats in a large warehouse. My dad had a shipping warehouse on the eastern shore of Virginia.
Yeah.
We used rat shot.
I
in the
used
warehouse.
rats, but surely they weren't powerful enough to, in your rifle, you know, to inject. But so I had many trips over to the island. Even when I came home from the service, Uncle Harwood was going over there occasionally, you know, to installing television or repairing them, and I would go over with him just as a helper, because for the 9 months immediately after I came home, immediately after I didn't have the Lucille to start taking out parties, I went down and hired on with Penrod and went off on the first rig that was right off the beach. And then after a couple, 3 months, I got on their little cargo boat that was hauling mud and supplies back and forth. So I worked 5 days on, 5 days off. So I would hang around Uncle Harwood's house and the shop and help there and help him install TVs, and, you know, just something to do. And if he went over to the island, I'd go with him.
So when you're saying that you would go with him, he was making a call to the ranch house.
Right, yeah.
What's that house like? Mark and I didn't have any luck getting in. We were trying to visit it, but
Yeah.
they wouldn't give us permission.
I've never been in the house. I've been outside, because I didn't care about necessarily going in, and most of, maybe I was helping him put up an antenna or something like that, because at that time television was progressing so rapidly. I mean, you had a new type of antenna every 6 months. It was a better receiver, and Mike was having fun with the rancher's son that was about my age to maybe even shoot some quail, which were very, very, very plentiful. And it was just a big wooden, white, typical big home built up on stilts.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that is Shell Creek.
The original, when you said the first offshore rig here, in the bay, they used to use essentially a barge. And
Yeah.
then, and with a derrick on it.
They
And
moved the barge in. And I'll tell you one thing there. They laid down a bed of mud shell, maybe 2 or 3 feet high.
this is in the
In the
Gulf.
bays.
Oh, in the bays.
And then they brought the barge in and settled it on that to give it a stable base. Then when they moved, maybe they didn't have a production well. So here was a reef. And Dad had it written on a piece of paper, the bearing, this water tower lined up with this tree on the beach and this lined up with that, and he could find those reefs. So that was his fishing places.
So that drilling really helped out with the fishing.
Yes, it really did. And then when they had a production well, it was a little
But you just
10
little
to 10
pipe.
structure, and then the pipes went, like to Shamrock Island, they had 2 or 3 out in the bay, and those were your shell, you had that shell bed there of 200 maybe by 100 feet, you know, on the top.
Now, how do they do on the offshore? Do they use the barge like they used to use?
Okay, that rig, these were the early day, the name of the man in Corpus, they started to name them the same name, 1, 2, 3, 4. Anyhow, they,
Oh, Jimmy Storm?
no. They built the platform and they pulled up an old the big landing ships,
LSTs?
you name it, okay. And they had modified the bow. And the bow came up close to the platform with a walkway, you know, separate them. And it probably had 6, 8 acres holding it in place. And that was the mud, the pumps, all the supplies, the living quarters. And because it was a ship, they had to have a captain, first mate, second mate, engineman, and 2 or 3 seamen. So that's where I went to work. I had third mate's papers, but they said I was too young. So I went to work as just a seaman. And after 2 or 3 months, I managed to get over onto the cargo boat, just as a seaman, because it paid a little more. And it was 5 days on, 5 days off, so you're still going back all the time. And Dad would just come down and visit, because he knew everybody at the harbor. And then there was an occasion that happened after about 6 months. Every time you turn around, they'd have a new skipper. They were towboat guys. They could run up and down the intercoastal, but they couldn't come in from offshore and hit the jetties. They didn't know how to do it. And so one night the guy was the tool pushing over, the head man of the rig. He was on the boat, and we're coming in 10 o'clock at night, and the guy was going to miss the jetties on the beach, and I started screaming and hollering. And the guy said, "No, I'm the skipper, I'm the skipper." And I said, we got in a pretty nasty conversation. And finally the tool pusher said, "Do you know how to get in?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You got it." So I took it back offshore, went out and came in, and I came in and I pulled over there on the lighthouse shore where we're talking about the Potomac. He said, "No, we're going this way." I said, I brought it in. And so we were sitting over there, and he said, "No." I said, "I'm getting paid as a seaman. You say I'm too young to be the captain. I'll take it in for you for $100. He said, "Well, I don't have $100. I said, "Well, get my dad on the phone." So he called what they called him, the port captain. He called my dad. Midnight, Dad went down, and they wrote him a check for $100. I said, "I'll accept the check." So I carried it in, and by daylight they had it loaded up with another load, and looking for a captain. And so they said, "Well, you take it out." And I said, $100. I want it right down my hands. And so for about
Good man.
3 or 4 trips, did 5 days off, and came back, they still hadn't found a captain, because they realized these guys could drive up and down the interstate, the
Intercoastal.
but had never been offshore. So then probably 3 shifts of that, it was $100 a trip each way. And then they were shutting the operation down and going to Louisiana, and I wouldn't go to Louisiana. So I piddled around, Mother and Dad and I went to Arizona, and 3-week trip out there, and then I went to school in May.
So they, in the very beginning though, they drive piles to give you to have a place.
Yeah, the drilling platform,
Okay.
quite massive within itself, but all of the operations, water, mud, power plant,
Was on the
that
LST.
ship. Yeah.
And so it wasn't something you'd float in the position like a jack-up rig and then, okay.
No, they were just
So,
piloting.
but in the very beginning, I guess you don't know one thing from
Well,
another,
it was
so
the
you.
first rig that operated out of Border Ranges and had nothing south. And I don't know how close the next rig or drilling platform would be up that way.
Now, did they run? Do you know? Did they actually get gas out there? Did they?
Yes, that became a product. I mean, they quote capped it off, shut it down, cut it off, and took the platform.
And so, did they run laterals into land? I mean, for have
That
a
rig,
manifold
that,
and then.
that probably sat there as a capped off well for several years. I know when I was in North Carolina in the early 71, when they had a little gas crisis, and they were complaining about the capped off wells out in the Gulf, and they were getting ready to build the Red Snapper line about that time, but they were waiting to get all the wells completed. And so I was trying to explain to people at the Southeast Gas Association, the New England Gas Association, those capped off wells are the money in the bank, until you get the market and get enough production to justify building the line in. So many of the wells that were drilled out here were quote capped off until they got enough wells to hook up, and I see a couple of platforms out off the jetty. I don't know whether it's an operating or whether it's involved in the big super tanker that come in or what, but back in the, say in the 50s, it was early 60s, it looked like a city almost out there, you know, the platforms that were there. But those first operations were that ship that they brought up to the, and say that water, let's say you're only half, 3/4 of a mile offshore, so you're not over 4 fathom, 5 fathom.
Swim back. How did your father get to be a friend of the Bonanno family?
In about the mid-60s,